Welcome back. I should probably title this episode How I Read and Relate to Sufi Texts, because I want to give a sense of what it's like to personally engage with classical Sufi texts of Ibn Arabi and his inheritors as a practitioner and also as a phenomenological psychologist. This is another companion piece to the Names of God podcast that I'm doing with my friend and colleague, Adnan Hussein. Descriptions of God found in Quran include names like the truthful, the just, the friend, the loving. In the tradition initiated by the medieval mystic Ibn Arabi, these names are viewed as simultaneously describing divinity and constituting a template for a complete human being. Why? First of all, because Ibn Arabi says that the divine names are relationships, nisab, relationships between the real and his creation. A radical idea that immediately challenges a dualistic view of God as being up there somewhere versus us down here. So instead, the names are a web of interrelated attributes through which divine oneness expresses itself in multiplicity, and by means of which individual beings, each in their own limited way, embody qualities that, when properly integrated and balanced, bring that being more fully into alignment with his or her source. Okay, so you might say, well, nice idea. What's the evidence? If you imagine yourself as someone who relates to the names of God experientially, or if that actually already describes your life, then a way to actualize and validate this model in real life would be finding out by sincerely striving toward a more psychologically and ethically integrated life. For example, strengthening your own capacity to be truthful, sadiq, and being ruthlessly honest with yourself about your lapses. Or say your availability to be a true friend. And then finding out if that sincere striving over time not only yields a more intact, healthier, more grounded life in this world with other people, but also deepens your sense of being connected to and belonging to creation as a whole, and to a source of meaningfulness in creation that transcends you. Now, notice that nothing I just said affirms a particular creed. And this is because I'm trying to give you an example of how a phenomenologist might approach this tradition without denying any particular creed or belief, but also not relying on a creed. So far I'm staying with the impacts of engaging with the names for you yourself. And what the school of Ibn Arabi adds to this picture is the claim that the meditative path of spiritual wayfaring leads you to personally verify that these attributes don't belong to you, that the most you can do is cooperate by making room for them to express themselves more fully through you, and strive to mitigate the excesses and imbalances of your particular character formation, with some humility and hopefully some humor. So the developmental path implies in these names aligning one's character traits. For example, one's capacity for expressing loving, but also one's capacity to withhold, one's capacity for forgiveness, and also one's capacity to punish if needed. These are all names within this framework: loving, withholding, punishing, forgiving. It's the archetype of complete human who most fully embodies the names and fulfills the relationship. The complete human, Insan al-Kamil, is envisioned as occupying a middle ground between the real and the created world. What's said to be revealed to seekers is an increasingly reliable connection to their transcendent source. And the claim that a dedicated seeker can experientially verify that his or her actions, attributes, and I-ness is found to be a moment and moment-to-moment endowment from the Absolute. And this is why you hear me using the expression qualified non-dualism. Okay, so what is that? Qualified non-dualism refers to spiritual traditions which claim that ultimate reality is one, but that this oneness expresses itself through a world of multiplicity, and that therefore this multiplicity, including multiple human selves, is already intrinsically meaningful, not just a misperception or ignorance. So from this perspective, human selfhood is not viewed as an illusion, as it would be in a strict non-dualism. For example, the non-self doctrine in Theravada Buddhism, which basically says there is no enduring personal self, period. In Theravada, the meditative path aims at awakening and liberation through freeing oneself from the illusion that one has a subsisting personal self. All that truly exists is said to be non-delimited, awakened mind, which has no personhood. See? But Akbari Sufism claims that human selves are not strictly separate from the one who is their source. In fact, they're utterly reliant upon that one. And yet, our relative individuality isn't only unique, but also precious and actually necessary as a place for divine oneness to come to know itself within the world of multiplicity, which means through us. So Ibn Arabi often mentions the expression, who recognizes themselves recognizes their Lord. This is often translated, who knows himself or who knows themselves knows their Lord. Okay, but I'm using the word recognizes for the Arabic word arafa, because arafa doesn't mean just mentally knowing something. It means direct personal acquaintanceship with someone, seeing and recognizing someone. See? But if we look around, how often do we feel that depth of recognition? With our friends, with our neighbors, among our fellow citizens, between peoples, between nations, right? So qualified non-dual way allows for the ongoing real experience of people failing to properly recognize themselves and each other, and failing to recognize their Lord, all of it, right? Meaning that people's chosen ignorance, we could say, and enactment of evil are also part of this picture. And for those who have a background in Islam, I'll mention the expression attributed to the Prophet. It goes like this: God will say on the day of resurrection, "O son of Adam, I was sick and you didn't visit me." He'll say, "O Lord, how should I visit you when you are the Lord of the worlds?" He'll say, "Didn't you know that my servant so-and-so was sick and you didn't visit him? Didn't you know that if you had visited him, you would have found me with him?" I always get choked up by that hadith. So when we fail to recognize each other, we fail to recognize him in that view. So that's a thumbnail sketch of the hermeneutic that I'm engaging in. You'll hear not only phenomenology, but existentialism and psychology, because I'm convinced that the multiple traditions I inhabit need to be re-understood and re-articulated in the here and now to be relevant in the world that we live in. And far from being some kind of deviant distortion, this is what it means to me to actually inhabit a tradition as something that's living and forward-looking. So Akbari Sufism, as an example of a qualified non-dualist view, is an alternative to either the strong emphasis on isolated, skin-encapsulated individualism that's typical in much of the West, where, at best we only get rare moments of communion with others or occasional glimpses of connection to the natural world. And on the other hand, it's an alternative to strict non-dualism, the no-self or non-self doctrine that's characteristic of some South Asian and East Asian traditions, for which the very notion that I have a meaningful individuated self is regarded as a kind of illusion. It's negated as fundamentally unreal. In contrast, the way that I understand spiritual wayfaring in Akbari Sufism, especially as it lands in secular societies like the one I live in, is that it's a call to both discover the uniqueness of the individual locus of consciousness that you are, an irreproducible, unrepeatable instance of personhood, but paradoxically, not through positive affirmations about you and your self-identity, though a little appreciation is no problem, but rather through the meditative discovery of your increasing transparency to a transcendent, unitive source of your selfhood. So, this is set to culminate in a life-changing effacement in the unitive ground of that selfhood. And that's what Sufism calls the arc of ascent. Sometimes it's called the journey to God, which has an end in that event. But that's just the beginning. Because in that comprehensive effacement in God, or in the real, that gathers into itself ownership of the actions, the attributes, and I-ness that you took to be your own possessions, your seemingly self-subsisting identity drops off entirely, only to be rediscovered, but from a radically different perspective. That's the event referred to as effacement, fana, or more inclusively as gathering, jam. So this ascent is classically meant to be accompanied by all kinds of not just meditative, but also ethical work. And it's also followed by the arc of descent, what Sufism sometimes calls the journey in God, which is endless, a return back into individuated life as an altered being who's still engaged in ethical refinement, recognizing deficits, dealing with conflicts in daily life. Not a picture of final arrival, as far as I'm concerned, but of ongoing completion in fluctuation, which is why Ibn Arabi, for example, claims that whereas other mystics aim at achieving a stable spiritual state, and actually these are the people that he refers to as Sufis, among those to whom he belongs, stability within fluctuation is considered superior to striving for a permanently stable state. So to me, what Adnan and I are trying to do will be a success if we're able to actually talk about the names of God in Islamic tradition and in the future Jewish, Christian, other traditions in ways that are accessible for people who may be acquainted personally with one of those traditions or might have no connection whatsoever to any of them and who aren't even necessarily looking for a religious perspective in the first place, but do have an interest in the farther reaches of consciousness. I'm very much aware that Adnan and I are speaking to multiple audiences at the same time, trying to, right? The two main ones that I have in mind are people who have a connection to Islam or Sufism, on the one hand, for whom lots of the terms we're using are going to be familiar, and who at the same time are unlikely to have studied the Sufis that we're talking about, much less heard any contemporary interpretations of the words of those Sufis. So that's one group. And another group, as important, are those who do not identify with Islam or maybe any religion in particular, but might have some personal experience with a form of meditation, or might simply be intrigued with the idea of a path toward personal acquaintanceship with the real. And the commonality between the varieties of people, these varieties, as far as I'm concerned, is that if you are keenly interested in the possibility of relating in a personal, embodied, lived way to the ground of your consciousness, to be more in touch with awareness as such, as an already given source of meaning, then whether or not one subscribes to any religion, whether or not the word meditation itself is even relevant for you, my aim is that there will be something for you in this series. For this reason, my priority in the series on the names of God is to model open questioning that's not constrained by theological commitments or cultural or ideological doctrines of any kind. So whatever models of consciousness I'm describing as a phenomenologist, I'm holding them within brackets, meaning holding them as possibilities, not affirming a doctrine, but inviting examination of possibilities which would need to be verified by you in person. And that commitment to open inquiry is what I've experienced over 30 years through meetings with unique teachers in Sufism who repeatedly showed themselves to be dedicated to liberation, not focused on membership in a particular group or adherence to a creed. So to close for now, if somebody's interested in my own background in Sufism, I would direct them to Yanis Tsoulis's book, Sufism and the Way of Blame, which I'll link to in the comments, in the description. The book provides an overview of the history and approach of that current within Sufism that I'm speaking from. But everything I've said today is a kind of preamble, actually, for what I'm going to turn to next time, lordship and servanthood.